somewhere in what had once been a Roman province, in a year when most people could not have told you what year it was, because calendars were kept only by monks and most people never saw a monk. A woman woke before dawn on a bed of straw covered with a rough woolen blanket. The fire in the center of the single room had burned low. The smoke had nowhere to go except up through a hole in the thatch, and some of it had not gone there. Her eyes stung. The smell around her was of ash, of the animal warmth of the cattle on the other side of the wattle partition, of bodies that had not been washed in weeks, of dried herbs hung from the rafters because someone, a grandmother or a traveling priest, had once said they kept sickness away. She rose, relieved herself in the corner designated for that, and walked outside into the gray cold of a world that had forgotten almost everything Rome had known about comfort. This is 748 CE, not the darkest point of the early medieval period, but deep enough into the post-Roman centuries that what had once been taken for granted in the Western Empire, clean water on demand, roads connecting towns, heated bathhouses, functioning drainage, a literate administrative class, all of it had contracted, fragmented, or simply vanished. What replaced it was not nothing. People are never nothing. But what replaced it was harder, smaller, colder, and shorter in every sense of the word. The phrase Dark Ages has fallen out of academic favor, and for good reason. Scholars prefer early medieval period, and they are right to complicate the old narrative of pure collapse. The church preserved literacy. Monasteries kept medicine alive, however imperfectly. The Carolingian dynasty under Charles Martel, and soon his grandson Charlemagne, was in the middle of reorganizing the Frankish world into something approaching administrative coherence. In England, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were building churches in stone and producing manuscripts of extraordinary beauty. In Scandinavia, a culture of remarkable seafarers was taking shape. The world of 748 CE was not empty. It was transforming. But transformation is not comfort. And for the vast majority of people alive in that year, the transformation was happening above their heads, in the halls of kings and the cells of abbots, while they worked the same fields their grandparents had worked, drank from the same streams, buried their children at roughly the same rate, and lived lives that archaeological evidence consistently tells us were difficult in ways we struggle to imagine from our present distance. Let us start with water, because everything starts with water. In the Roman era, aqueducts carried fresh water from distant springs into cities and towns. By 748 CE, most of those aqueducts in the former Western Empire were partially or fully non-functional. Rome's famous aqueducts had fallen into disrepair during the sieges of the 5th and 6th centuries. The populations that remained in former Roman urban centers, often dramatically smaller than their imperial-era predecessors, drew water from wells, from rivers, or from natural springs. In rural settlements, which is where the overwhelming majority of people lived, water came from whatever source was nearest. That meant streams and rivers that also received the waste of the settlement upstream, the runoff from animal pens, and the seepage from rudimentary latrines, if latrines existed at all. The biological consequences were significant. Waterborne illness was endemic. Dysentery, typhoid, and a range of intestinal parasites were so common that skeletal and coprolite analysis from early medieval burial sites frequently shows evidence of chronic parasitic infection. Work done on burials from Anglo-Saxon England, from Merovingian France, and from Scandinavian sites consistently finds evidence of intestinal worms, liver flukes, and other parasites that modern sanitation has made rare in the developed world. People were not ignorant of contamination in some abstract sense. They knew that bad water made you sick, but the infrastructure to do anything comprehensive about it simply was not there. And the knowledge of why contamination occurred, the germ theory of disease, was more than 1,000 years away. Waste disposal in a settlement of 748 CE was managed with varying degrees of organization depending on the wealth and complexity of the community. In monastic settlements, which represent something close to the most organized living arrangements of the era, there were often designated latrines, sometimes built over running water. At a site like Wearmouth Jarrow in Northumbria, the monastery where the Venerable Bede had died just a few years before 748, there was real architectural effort put into the functioning of the community's physical infrastructure. But monastic communities were exceptional. In the ordinary rural farmstead, the ordinary thane's estate, the ordinary clustered village, waste went into midden heaps, into designated corners, or simply into the field, where at least it served as fertilizer. The smell of a medieval settlement was not something that required imagination. The archaeological evidence from midden deposits, the density of fly pupae, the animal and human remains, all of it speaks to an olfactory environment that was simply part of the texture of life. Hygiene, in the sense of personal cleanliness, existed but looked very different from anything we would recognize. The stereotype that medieval people never bathed is an exaggeration, but it contains a truth about frequency and method. Hot water required fuel and effort. Fuel meant wood, and wood meant labor. And in a world of subsistence farming where every calorie of human energy was allocated to survival, heating large amounts of water for bathing was a luxury of time and resource. People washed their hands and faces regularly. They washed more thoroughly when they could, in rivers and streams during warmer months, in wooden tubs when fuel permitted. Hair was combed, and combs appear frequently in the archaeological record. Beautiful objects sometimes, even in humble graves. Bone combs, antler combs, found alongside the people who had used them. Lice were universal. Analysis of human remains from this era across Europe almost invariably finds evidence of lice. You managed them. You combed for them. You accepted them. They were part of the texture of existence. Teeth tell us a great deal. A dental analysis from early medieval skeletal remains shows a population with significant dental wear, occasional abscesses, and tooth loss, but fewer cavities than you might expect because refined sugar did not yet exist in Northern Europe and the diet, while nutritionally impoverished in some respects, was not as sugar-heavy as later medieval or modern diets. Honey was the sweetener, and it was expensive. People chewed coarse bread and tough meat and gritty ground grain, and their teeth wore accordingly. A 40-year-old in 748 CE often had the dental profile we might associate with someone much older, but they had earned that wear through a lifetime of chewing food that required chewing. New food itself was the organizing principle of daily existence, in a way that is genuinely difficult for those of us in food-secure societies to internalize. The agricultural year was a cycle of precarity. In 748 CE, across the Frankish world and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, the primary crops were emmer wheat, rye, barley, and oats. Legumes, peas, and beans especially, were critical protein sources. Vegetables like turnips, onions, and leeks were grown in kitchen gardens. Livestock, cattle, pigs, sheep, and chickens provided meat, milk, eggs, and wool. But slaughtering your livestock was a calculation, because a dead cow was meat now and nothing later. Animals were kept alive as long as they were productive. The autumn slaughter, when animals too numerous to feed through winter were killed and their meat salted or smoked, was one of the most important events of the agricultural year. Famine was not an abstraction. The chronicles from this period, maintained by monasteries, record famines with a regularity that speaks to how close to the edge most communities lived. A bad harvest, a late frost, a flooding of river plains at the wrong moment, and the margin between subsistence and starvation narrowed rapidly. The people most likely to survive were those with access to stored grain, which meant the powerful and the monastic communities with their carefully maintained granaries. The people most likely to die were the poor, the landless, and the very young and very old. Children died with heartbreaking frequency. Early medieval cemeteries show infant and child mortality rates that are painful to sit with. Perhaps a third of children born in this era did not survive to the age of 5. Skeletal analysis of children's remains frequently shows evidence of nutritional stress. Enamel hypoplasia in the teeth indicating periods of starvation or illness during growth, and signs of diseases we now prevent with vaccines or treat with antibiotics. A mother in 748 CE had likely buried at least one child. Many had buried several. This was not a culture of callousness toward children. The grave goods placed in children's burials, the small objects, the miniature combs, the tokens of affection, speak to genuine grief. But grief was a constant companion, and people built their emotional architecture around the expectation of loss in a way that we, accustomed to longer life expectancies, can barely conceptualize. The shelter varied enormously by social position. At the top, in the halls of kings and great lords, timber structures of impressive scale housed extended households, warriors, servants, and dependents. The Great Hall at Yeavering in Northumbria, excavated in the 20th century, gives us a glimpse of what Anglo-Saxon royal accommodation looked like. A large timber building, high enough for a central fire with smoke rising to vented eaves, furnished with benches along the walls, hung with textiles and weapons. It was drafty, smoky, and cold by modern standards, but it was also a space of social complexity and, on feasting nights, of genuine warmth and communal celebration. The mead was real. The songs were real. The sense of belonging to something larger than the daily grind of survival was real. For peasants and unfree laborers, which meant most people, shelter was far more modest. The typical rural dwelling of the period was a sunken featured building, what archaeologists call a Grubenhäuser, literally a pit house, or a simple above-ground timber-framed structure with wattle and daub walls and a thatched roof. Many homes housed both people and their most valuable animals. The livestock's body heat contributed meaningfully to warming the space. The livestock's waste contributed meaningfully to the smell. Archaeological excavations of these structures find the debris of daily life. Loom weights, spindle whorls, fragments of hand-thrown pottery, animal bones, charred grain, the material remains of lives lived in small, dark, warm spaces where every member of the household had a role in keeping everyone else alive. Where medicine in 748 CE was a mixture of genuine herbal knowledge, Roman medical tradition filtered through monastic manuscript culture, and ritual practice that the Church technically disapproved of, but could never entirely suppress. The Venerable Bede and his contemporaries at Northumbrian monasteries were working with Latin medical texts inherited from late antiquity. Monks trained in these traditions had real knowledge of plants, of wound treatment, of basic surgical intervention. But access to monastic medicine was not universal. For most people, illness was treated with whatever the local healer, often a woman, had learned from her own teachers. Poultices, infusions, charms, prayers to saints, and offerings at healing springs were all part of the same practical toolkit. However, the boundary between medicine and religion was porous because both were fundamentally concerned with the same problem: keeping the body alive in a world that was constantly trying to kill it. Saints and their relics were not merely theological abstractions in 748 CE. They were practical resources. A piece of cloth touched to the bones of a holy person kept in a reliquary at a local church was understood to carry genuine protective and healing power. The chronicles of this era describe miracles at shrines with the matter-of-fact tone that we might use to describe a visit to a pharmacy. This was how the universe worked, according to everything people knew and believed. The saint interceded with God on behalf of the petitioner. The relic concentrated sacred power in physical form. If you survived your fever, the saint had helped. If you did not survive, that too was within God's design, and your soul was in hands more capable than any healers. Death in 748 CE was handled with care and ritual. Christian burial had by this point largely replaced the pagan cremation practices of earlier centuries in England and on the continent. Though Scandinavia was still a generation or more away from a widespread Christianization, bodies were washed, wrapped in linen when families could afford it, and buried in churchyard cemeteries or in the grounds of estate churches. Grave goods, the practice of placing objects with the dead, had largely faded in Christian contexts, though personal ornaments sometimes accompanied the body. The community gathered, prayers were said, the body was committed to the earth, and the living went back to the work of survival. You can still stand in places where this world left its marks. At Sutton Hoo in Suffolk, the ship burial of a 7th century Anglo-Saxon king predating our year of 748 by roughly a century, sits beneath a grass mound that has become one of the great archaeological sites of Europe. The objects recovered there, the helmet, the gold work, the imported Byzantine silverware, speak to a world of trade, craft, and artistic ambition that the word dark does not begin to do justice. At Hedeby in modern Germany, the remains of a Viking-era trading town show a community of merchants, craftspeople, and travelers connected by sea lanes to Scandinavia, the British Isles, and the Eastern world. At Jarrow, you can still visit the ruins of Bede's Monastery, the place where one of the most extraordinary intellects of the early medieval period worked by lamplight in a cold stone room, writing the history of a people still in the process of becoming. What these people figured out, slowly, at enormous cost, matters. The open field farming system that began taking shape in this era reorganized the landscape of Northern Europe for centuries. The monastic breweries that maintained consistent ale production across the cold months kept communities hydrated on something safer than raw stream water. The legal codes assembled by Anglo-Saxon kings like Ine of Wessex or Ethelbert of Kent laid conceptual groundwork for ideas about rights and obligations that would eventually, through centuries of transformation, feed into constitutional traditions still operating today. The village structures, the church parishes, the estate boundaries of the early medieval world are often still visible in the landscape of modern England and France and Germany, written in the names of places and the lines of old field boundaries that persist in satellite imagery. What we will never fully know is what it felt like. We have the bones, the pots, the manuscripts, the place names. We do not have the interior life of the woman who woke before dawn in 748 CE, who walked out into the cold and looked at a sky full of stars over a landscape of fields and forest and the distant pale shape of a Roman ruin, and who thought whatever she thought about her life, her children, her god or gods, her chances. We can reconstruct the conditions. We cannot reconstruct the consciousness. And perhaps that is the most human thing about the Dark Ages, or any age. The vast majority of people who lived through them left no record of what it meant to them. And we are left wondering and grateful for the wondering, and perhaps a little humbled by how much they endured. and how little of it they needed us to bear witness to.